Horton, but it's much better to let her share her own story. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Dr. Horton to the podium.
It was wonderful. Congratulations.
Thank you, Deb.
Am I on? Yeah. Well, congratulations. Congratulations, Joanna. And what a privilege for us to share this morning the information that she's given us. You know, transformation is the job of all of us forever. People in treatment, people out of treatment. And this morning I'm going to talk a little bit about Bill Wilson, who was, if you're new in sobriety, maybe you don't know who he is. He was one of the founders of AA. About his transformation, about my own, and about a method that I believe was inspired and given me to help other people in recovery and not in recovery heal, grow, and have emotional maturity and sobriety. But first, let me start with Bill Wilson. In 1958, Bill Wilson wrote an article that was published in the Grapevine entitled "The Next Frontier, Emotional Sobriety." And I know a lot of you have read that. And in looking at it, I found two things that he had to overcome to achieve emotional sobriety himself. The first, he said he was very dependent on all kinds of things, AA, his family, work, whatever. And the other was that he said that he was immature and had to grow up. He was talking as a man who'd been in recovery for some time, and he was challenging a lot of old-timers to get their act together, grow up, cut dependencies, because why? Because as he said, with having done those things, he could come out and find a gentle place, a little gentle place in the bright sunshine. I don't know how he cut his dependencies. I don't know how he became emotionally mature. But I can tell you that he had to do it because he really, let me back up, because he wanted something more than he wanted to stay stuck. He wanted to be able to live the 11th step prayer. If you're new to the program, again, you may not know what that is. It's the St. Francis prayer. And in it, we ask to become an instrument of peace, an instrument of peace in the world. And in order to be an instrument of peace, in order to be able to give love where there's hatred, a spirit of forgiveness where there's wrong, harmony where there's discord, truth to error, we need a base of love. Unless I'm selfless, and at the bottom of the 11th step prayer it talks about through self-forgetting we find. But how, if I'm all bound up in fear and trauma, can I give that love? Can I extend myself? If I'm needy, how can I give freely to you, right? So the cutting of dependencies and the growing up involved developing a base of love within himself that was strong enough to be able to allow him to love others, to serve others, to be free, and to be in that bright sunshine. No, he wanted that. He wanted that very much. Well, I wanted something else when I was an adult. When I had just about grown up, I wanted to be able to put my children first. Because I was immature, because I was stuck in fear from traumas of my childhood, I struggled to be able to give my kids a sense that they were my priority, since I hadn't felt I had been a priority in my own childhood. And I remember one time when I had that experience, and I'll tell you how it came to that in a minute. I was sitting on the bed with my son in New York City. I had an aftercare center there that was based on years of work at Hazelden, of having a master's, the first master's at Hazelden in addictions. And, you know, I thought I was sort of hot shit. And the thing was I would sit with my son, and who was a senior in high school at the time, and we would have conversations, and he would say, well, let me tell you about my schoolwork today, or let me tell you about my girlfriend, or let me tell you about something. And after he'd talked for a little bit, and I said, but I want to talk about me. I want to tell you about my day. I want to tell you about whatever. And on this one day, I remember crying when he left the room because he had shared about his day and his girlfriend and his schoolwork and whatever, and I had been able to be quiet and not compete with him in any way. I had become a person who could self-forget, and that was just remarkable to me. It gives me chill bumps even to think about it, because I was a poster child for what Joanna's been talking about. And then I had a secret that allowed me to go back into my childhood and create a base that allowed me to create a healing method that I'll tell you about. But let me start at about age 8. At age 8, my father came back from the war, very traumatized, manic depressive, alcoholic, and he had shell shock. And in those days, shell shock is the same thing as PTSD. He beat me. My mom would hide behind the door and do nothing. And then when I was 8, he shot himself with a gun my mom left in the house, and I found the body. I knew it was my fault because I'd gone to a picnic my mother had organized instead of staying home with him. And of course, when I came home, there he was. Nobody ever held me. Nobody ever helped me get over that trauma. So like Joanna's definition of trauma, I had an event that I simply couldn't handle and deal with. And then my mom's alcoholism, and I think mainly because she felt guilty. I think she set him up, and I think she felt guilty. And so for years, I was really a lost soul. Mom had a couple of other husbands, and then as an adult, I tried to go to college. It took me 6 universities and a year of nursing school to finally get a degree. I mean, I was just really lost. And then finally, I got sober. You know, it was one of those experiences that God really just took me out of a second marriage, plunked me at the Harmony Foundation in Estes Park. I stayed there for a few months, but got sober. And stayed sober for 4 years, but I wasn't at all sure I was an alcoholic because my mom and dad were both daily drinkers. And so I kept praying, please, oh God, show me, am I really an alcoholic? Because I knew AA would save my life. I knew the steps were right, and I felt loved in the program. And so what happened was this gorgeous guy moved in next to me. I was living in Rifle, Colorado. I had a little alternative high school that I was teaching, that I'd started. And he said, my darling, I saw your ankles, and I'd love to take you for a drink. And I thought, you got it, you know. So off we went to the Elks Club, and I started drinking. I hadn't drunk for 4 years, but I drank and I drank and I drank, mainly to oblivion. I was ashamed of myself. I'd been the Vestal Virgin of Rifle, Colorado. And finally, at the end of about 6 weeks, I realized this was going to be threatening, and I was raising 2 adolescents by myself at the time. And so I got down on my hands and knees, and I said, God, please help me. I don't know what to do. I had that prayer of desperation, that wonderful sense that I couldn't do it myself. And that night, we all went out to play volleyball, and the tall, beautiful Botswanan surveyor who'd liked my ankles came down with his elbow on my mouth, broke my tooth. I went to the dentist and was given a Percodan. And the Percodan made me so sick that I couldn't do anything. I was just stuck. That was the 11th of December, 1983. I'm sorry, 1987. And so the next day, my mom, who got sober and was now manager of all patient care at Hazelden, and she was that for about 10 years, my mom arrived. I mean, I'm not going to drink around my mom, right? But I realized on that carpet, when my prayer was answered, that I was an alcoholic. 2 years later, with a little bit of sobriety under my belt, I decided I needed a master's degree, and so I went to Hazelden, because my mom happened to be there. If she'd been in Massachusetts, I'd have gone there. But I went to Hazelden, and through strict nepotism, I was hired into the aftercare office. And that was when my real life started. The people in the aftercare office, and some of you who are old-timers may have known Ed Juergens at Hazelden or John Lucy at Hazelden. They were wonderful. They were saints. And they helped me get a master's degree, and they really loved me. And when I went home to my mom and my 2 kids, that was like work. And when I was at Hazelden, it was like home. But what happened was, several times during the year of feeling really loved and centered and safe and learning the steps and working on my master's degree and doing all of that, I would still self-destruct. I would still, my dog had to be put to sleep, my mom had cancer. At those times of real crisis in my life, what I would do is self-destruct. And the way I self-destructed was get involved with a dysfunctional man. And I would be in that relationship until the pain of my real life would dissipate enough, and then I would go back to my real life. And I did this over and over, and it was terrifying for me. 1982, I became aftercare director of a center in Pennsylvania. And about 6 months into it, and I did another self-destruct exercise when I was doing so well teaching people how to love themselves. I certainly wasn't loving myself. With this local man that I had insisted on being involved with. I had an experience of visualizing the little 8-year-old inside of me. It was a miracle. And it happened in the aftercare, in the director's office of the center, and he was holding me and my eyes were closed. And I saw her. He said, you know, how old would a child be who'd react in the way you're reacting? And I said, I don't know, 8 or 9. And he said, what happened to you then? And I saw her. And when I saw her, I realized she was almost dead. She was translucent like a fish. And he said, what are you going to do with her? And I said, well, I'm going to go love her. And so it took me 3 years of focusing on the inner aspect of myself for that little girl of 8 to morph into older and older ages. It was all inner work. But at the end of the 3 years, I was walking down First Avenue in New York City where I had an my aftercare center that I told you about. And I realized I was one person, that the inner person and the outer person were the same age. And at that hour, my prayer then was, well, what do I do with the rest of my life? You know, I need meaning in life. I have this degree, I've done aftercare. But I had a secret, and that was that I was failing in my aftercare center. And what was happening was I would be working as well as I could in the way that Hazelden had trained me, in group and privately with people, individually with people. And at the end of 6 to 8 to 9 months, if they had to take a big, enormous, but very important risk for them, very often they would drink or use drugs. And I knew that I wasn't helping them in some way. So I stopped working. I stopped the center. Lenny Holzer, my buddy, and I started alcohol and drug programs at Princeton University and stuff with money from him. He started a little foundation. But for a while, it was like I didn't know what to do with myself. And then I was asked to write a book. And I was asked to write a book about healing and parenting for adult children of alcoholics. And I tried to do the outline, and I said, you know, this isn't working for me. If a parent hasn't grown up, they have no business parenting. And so for 3 years, I wrote my book, Growing Up in Adulthood, The Journey to Emotional Sobriety, and in hardback, it's called The Seashell People, Growing Up in Adulthood. And it's like the seashell for me was all the defenses that Joanna was talking about in her talk. After the book was published, and I really didn't have a method to help other people, I went back to New York City thinking I probably would work more with people in recovery again. But people began to find me at bus stops and in the post office, and they would say, well, you know, what do you do? And I said, well, I would just publish this book, blah, 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 blah. And they'd say, well, I'm stuck. Now I need help. And I thought, oh, my God, what am I supposed to do with this? So I started trying to help people. But what I knew was core for me had been the connection to the inner child, to the inner little girl who was traumatized. And so through guided imagery, as a base for this method that began to develop, I help people visualize the part of themselves that's stuck and love and apply love to that part of that person. And the miraculous thing, I still don't know how it happens, it still seems woo-woo to me, is that when that kid who was 8 shifted ages, what was happening with my patients or clients in my practice was they were quickly going through the ages. It didn't take them 3 years. It took them maybe a month, maybe 6 weeks, to be able to visualize their own age person inside. And then, because I really didn't know what to do next, what I found was they needed to be toughened. You know, and toughening had happened for me with my mom for the 2 years that I lived with her when I was getting ready to have the book sold and published. Because my mom would say horrible things to me like, your book will never sell, your kids don't love you, you have a peculiar odor. I mean, she was really loving. And I would have to go off to my bedroom and say, all right, you going to let her destroy you or not? Are you going to deal with this fear that she might be right or not? And so I would come back into the living room, and like Joanna said, what happened was it took me shorter and shorter times to be able to deal with myself and to be able to agree with her perhaps, but to be able to say, can I love myself through it if my book doesn't sell? So when a person is growing, when we're now our own age, the next thing that needs to happen is that we need to toughen. We need to become tempered, as we say in Spanish, which means banging on the metal and becoming harder. And then the next ingredient of that I found is that we need to reconnect, and we now can reconnect to that voice of God or voice of guidance within us, and follow that guidance to peace. If we're not courageous, if we're not selfless, if we don't have that core that we've developed of loving ourselves, addressing ourselves in all the trauma places, so we're at our own age, so that we have that base of self-love, we really can't live in a free place outside of ourselves. You know, I wanted what Bill Wilson wanted, but I wondered what God wanted. And I think the whole setup is God wants us to be at peace, wants us to have joy. The two things that Bill Wilson said eluded him when he was dependent and he was immature. I think God wants us to be at peace. And the way we get to peace is being obedient to that inner guidance. It means being mature enough to be able to handle ourselves and be courageous enough to follow the guidance to peace. Thank you.